This is Open Minds Radio. Here again, your host, UFO paranormal researcher and journalist, Alejandro Rojas.
And we have a great show today. In fact, I think we're one of the rare radio shows to have this guest today, and that is the Honorable Paul Hellyer, someone who is actually used to be the Minister of Defense for Canada. So, and one interesting thing, one of the main things we're going to be talking about, is his book, Light at the End of the Tunnel. For those of you who are watching in video, I'll hold it up here for the camera. His new book, where he calls it a survival plan for the human species. So it's all about his wisdom and the idea that, you know what, we better shapen up or ship out. We're in big trouble because, as we know, we're pretty much headed for destruction very fast. We seem to kind of, you know, think about how we're using up all our resources, and, you know, some good people out there try to do something about it, but we're not really taking the bold steps we need to curb this just raping and pillaging of our planet that we're going through. However, more specifically, and what this show's content is about, is UFOs. He also talks about UFOs. Many of you know that. Some of you may not. And in the book, he mentions how he is the first cabinet member level person of a G8 country who has come forward talking about UFOs. So we'll talk about how that came about, really how his interest was triggered, unfortunately, after he was working for the Ministry of Defense in Canada. And it was much, much more recently, in fact, just like 6 years ago, that he got into it after a Peter Jennings special, which you all might have seen. The first one, there were two of them, talking about UFOs. And then he really looked into it. And, in fact, he discovered that the Colonel Corso book was the real deal. And we have, and I don't know if he's seen it. Well, he probably has. We have on our website Colonel Corso's personal notes, and that were not put out until we did that just a few months ago, at least in English. In Italian, they were put out. It's called The Dawning of a New Age. But really, it goes into his thought processes behind why he did what he did and what they were thinking in the Army when they were examining the whole UFO extraterrestrial incident. And they were examining it at a very high policy level. You know, what do we do as the people interested in securing the United States of America? And that's what is really exciting about being able to talk to Hellyer, because he thinks at that level. He's thinking at, you know, what are the implications of the secrecy, the implications of America keeping this secret from its allies, and what that means for him in his capacity in the past and now as kind of a activist, and what it would mean for our future, what damage has been done by holding this information back. So I'm very excited to talk to him. This is a rare opportunity, and we're very fortunate to have him. Also, as usual, a couple reminders. The UFO Congress is coming up, ufocongress.com. That is the largest UFO conference in these United States, and it's going to be here in the Phoenix metro area. You can get there really cheap. Southwest flies in. Great airport to get in and out of, too. Very simple airport. And it's a lot of fun because you get to meet a lot of UFO researchers. We're having some of the best in the business, like Leslie Kean, who just wrote the book on UFOs, with inclusion from government officials and you know, even a general from Iran, and Fife Symington, the guy who was the governor of Arizona, out here during the Phoenix Lights, who talks about his sighting of the Phoenix Lights when that all went down. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We're really, really excited about the Congress this year. I think we've got an excellent lineup, and you can go to ufocongress.com and look at the speaker list to see what is mostly the final lineup. There might be some slight changes from here until then, because you never know. Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans, right? That's what good old John Lennon used to tell us. And it holds true, so we never know what might happen. There's no guarantees in life, but it's going to be a real exciting event, so be sure and book that soon. That's going to be late February, the 23rd to the 27th. And also visit the website regularly because we're adding events and cool stuff all of the time. And, of course, the magazine is out, our 4th issue on Rendlesham. We've gotten a lot of great feedback on some of the UFO crash cases that we've done and the other neat things that are in there. There's a MUFON abduction study. Some people think MUFON's not interested in abduction, but indeed they are. And in fact, they have a group that is focused on that. Some of them are psychologists. Some of them are PhDs and therapists and researchers for a long time. So really interesting study there, essentially showing that, that contrary to what some of the people even at Harvard had said, without studying this, just kind of their knee-jerk reaction is that people who experience abductions are prone to fantasy, and that is just simply not true according to the numbers. Do the study. Quit throwing this stuff out, Quit being jerks, man. Work with us here. That was for the Harvard people, not you regular listeners, because you're wonderful. Speaking of wonderful, Jason McClellan is wonderful, and he is our news correspondent. And on our website, we put up news every day, and we follow the UFO news in the media. And, of course, there's one giant story this week, although there's some other stories. And Jason is here as our news correspondent to fill us in. Jason, tell us what's going on out there.
Greetings, Alejandro, and hello, world. This is your Open Minds News Brief for Monday, October 18th, 2010. The discovery of Gliese 581g, the Earth-like planet outside our solar system, has generated lots of speculation about extraterrestrial life, because experts have said the likelihood of life on the planet is quite good. It's not uncommon for the topic of religion to enter the discussion of extraterrestrial life. If there is intelligent life on Gliese 581g, there are those here on Earth who believe that inhabitants of the planet are destined for hell. Ken Ham, an author and religious public speaker who runs the organization Answers in Genesis, believes that the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden affected the entire universe and that there is no hope of salvation for Gleesans because only descendants of Adam can be saved.
That's too bad.
They didn't do anything.
Yeah, we haven't even met them yet. They may be wonderful.
And they're screwed already for something that someone on another planet did.
Yeah, well,
It is interesting. And, for newcomers to the research into UFOs and extraterrestrials, there is a lot of Christianity that gets involved in it. People speculating, well, what does that mean for Christianity and other religions?
Mm-hmm. Luckily, these guys are the minority, even though, of course, they have such a controversial view that you hear about them. Even the Catholic Church, people, representatives from there, the Roman Catholics and, the Vatican don't feel that way. Hopefully, it's going to be an interesting aspect, like we talked about with Bryce Zabel, who was on the show with the book After Disclosure. What religions are going to do, how they're going to react once disclosure happens. And I think there's going to be so many scenarios in this whole area of religion that we haven't even thought yet that are going to crop up.
Some of the more fascinating religious points I've heard are from the researcher Eric von Daniken and his writings talking about things from the Bible and what he calls ancient aliens. And in fact, the History Channel did a series called Ancient Aliens, if I'm remembering correctly. And they talk a lot about von Daniken's search into that and talking about the ancient aliens.
Yeah, people love that show. And we got to meet him, luckily, in Mexico. Yeah. And a real nice guy. And that sort of thing is so fascinating. There are even religious, scholars in the church who speculate that perhaps some of the Bible stories are interactions with extraterrestrials.
It's fascinating, it's taking something that people have had one mindset about for so long and then throwing something entirely different into it, making people rethink what they've thought all along. But this whole Gliese planet these new discovered planets is a fascinating story in itself, because there's a lot of back and forth now about whether or not the planet even exists.
Yeah.
That's been called into question. Then there's been claims that signals have been detected from the area where this planet is. So it's an exciting time right now. We talk a lot about space exploration and things that all these probes are detecting now, but it seems new information about this this new system comes out every week.
Yeah. Well, you know, on Star Trek, you know, the Vulcans didn't disclose themselves until the humans had reached a certain level or accomplished a certain task. In this case, it was the warp speed engine, I remember, in Star Trek. So, I mean, it could be, you know, these little steps bring us closer and closer to being able to accept that. And regardless of if Gliese 581G is the one or not, we'll definitely run across some planets in what they call that Goldilocks zone where of habitable planets. But it, like you said, it is making people think that, wow, it's one thing to know that these planets most likely exist. It's another to actually be able to point one out and know for a fact, you know, it's proven that one exists, and to then makes people think a little bit harder about, wow, if we have these, you know, planets that are so similar to ours, and, you know, our world is so abundant with life, that what are those implications? It brings the whole subject a little closer to home and makes those people who are very conservative or skeptical even start to think about, you know, what this means and what this could mean to their lives.
I'm very excited about it, and I'm certainly one who is keeping my fingers crossed, hoping that Gliese 581G actually exists.
Think of, even if disclosure doesn't happen or whatever, and we move along at this snail's pace, think of the first probe to a planet like that. The first probe, or the first pictures and images of complex life on another planet, even if it's like some of the speculation that you see on History Channel or something like that, what extraterrestrial animals may look like. Just think of the first time seeing an extraterrestrial animal. I mean, that is so fascinating, so incredible. That alone would be really cool.
Well, with the progress that's being made, I'm sure we'll see it in our lifetime, my friend.
I hope so, buddy.
T.L. Keller, an aerospace engineer at UCLA School of Engineering, recently wrote a book entitled The Total Novice's Guide to UFOs, What You Need to Know. The book touches on the Roswell story and other UFO incidents. And, as the title indicates, the book is geared towards those who know little or nothing about UFOs. And, incidentally, the book is now on sale and can be purchased from Open Minds at openminds.tv.
Nice.
Yeah, I didn't realize we had this book in our store.
Oh, really?
No, I didn't. But no, I think a book like this is great. You know, there are a lot of researchers in this field, a lot of good researchers, good writers, and write these very thick books about some topics that are way over the heads of the novice, just wanting to know more about the subject.
Yeah.
So I think a book like this, a book geared towards the novice, is important for people who want to know more about this field.
Yeah, it's a cool book too because it has a lot of pictures. But I mean, it looks like a college lecture book, which is funny because college books, of course, have a lot of pictures, which is good. I mean, they understand these days you can't just have boring text. There's different ways that people learn.
I like pictures.
Yeah, and it's a big deal in college manuals these days to have great pictures that can explain complex ideas with an image. And he's done a good job with this book. It's thick, it's big, it's worth the money, and it is just very. It's a great presentation. It's very professional. It reminds me of a college book.
Did he pay you to say that?
No, I have not even talked to this guy nor received a dime,
well,
unfortunately.
I'm sure he'd be happy to hear that endorsement, Alejandro. And last week seemed like a big week for UFO books.
Yeah.
There was a lot in the news about books relating to UFOs. Last Wednesday's books section in the Washington Post featured 3 UFO books. The first being Paranormal America, Ghost Encounters, UFO Sightings, Bigfoot Hunts, and Other Curiosities in Religion and Culture. And the claim is made in this book that 1 in 5 Americans have seen something in the sky they could not identify, which is a cool statistic. I usually hear statistics about people who think UFOs are real, but not specifically about people who have actually seen something themselves in the sky.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a cool statistic. The second book they mentioned was Leslie Kean's book, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. And that's been a New York Times bestseller, very good book. And the final book that was listed in the book section of the Washington Post last week was Mirage Men, an adventure into paranoia, espionage, psychological warfare, and UFOs. The book by Mark Pilkington. Now, this is the book where he claims that a lot of UFO stories were actually seeded by the government to cover up military aircraft and things that were top secret projects.
Yeah, I think we talked about that book before, and it's an interesting concept. And the thing is he's not, saying that that's not, the reality of the phenomena doesn't exist, but that he has some evidence to show that some of it was created. And how funny that is. I mean, think of you being someone in the military who's working on black projects and you don't know anything about UFOs. Maybe you're skeptical and you think they're all silly. The whole idea is silly. And you think, but you know what? I can use this to my advantage. We can put out some false information, and so I can make sure and help my projects, stay where they are, and people not have any clue about them and think, these things we're building are UFOs. And it's possible some of these guys are totally in the dark about any UFO research going on and doing these separate projects.
He also makes a good point, and it's an unfortunate point, but he does mention that some UFO stories, especially conspiracy-oriented stories, have a tendency to take on a life of their own and kind of generate themselves as people start speculating.
Yeah, which it does happen. We've seen it this week, which is, I'm sure some stuff we're going to get into. But yeah, books, lots of books. And in fact, I think one day, every story, we put up 5 stories, and every single one of those 5 stories related to books coming out.
Yeah, it's a big book week. And that's interesting, that a lot of people are not only are the books being published, but the books are getting attention,
Yeah, especially this kind of attention.
And in a time where, people are printing less because people want things in digital form or whatever, people are still buying books, and the books are getting attention. This is great. London's Royal Albert Hall will host a Close Encounters event next week. This is a week-long festival that will explore the world of extraterrestrial activity with talks, exhibitions, tours, family workshops, film screenings, inflatable planetariums, and free concerts. And Nick Pope, formerly of Britain's Ministry of Defense, will be speaking at this event.
Is he going to be speaking in an inflatable planetarium?
I haven't seen any information to indicate that, but if I were speaking at the event, I think that would be
that'd be kind of fun if it's like this inflatable stage and he has to, take his shoes off and bounce around while he talks.
I don't see Nick Pope doing that.
He might. He's a fun guy, Jason. He may seem like a serious individual, but he's a real fun guy, and he'll do what it takes. Trust me. Especially after a couple pints. He loves his pints.
I would love to buy Nick Pope a pint.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun. In fact, he does impressions. You might
does
not
he really?
of other ufologists.
Does he really?
Yeah, and I haven't even seen any, unfortunately. I keep hearing about him, and for some reason, probably because I don't go hang out at the bar too often, I keep missing his impressions.
Well, in February at the UFO Congress, we'll have to get some impressions out of him.
Yeah, which he'll be there. But it does, I wonder what that is, an inflatable planetarium.
I don't know. I think that was a minor point to the story, Alejandro.
But I get excited. I like the little bouncing around in those
I do too.
Bouncy castles.
Let's get on to the big news from the week.
All right.
The big news from last week was the report of UFOs over New York City. On Wednesday, curious New Yorkers stopped to look up at multiple UFOs in the afternoon sky, above Manhattan's west side. Many witnesses called 311, which is New York City helpline. They also called the NYPD and the FAA seeking information about the strange objects. FAA spokesman Jim Peters told the Washington Post, "Every once in a while you get phone calls from people who see something they can't explain." Some witnesses described the UFOs as silvery and shiny and hovering or bobbing. Some witnesses reported seeing up to 50 UFOs at one point. The FAA said they received reports of something that was yellow with blue lights surrounding it, but the FAA was unable to detect anything in the sky at that time. Many suspect that the mysterious objects were merely balloons, but police did not investigate the incident, and city officials agree with the balloon theory. Many balloons were present at a celebration in Times Square that day, and additionally, a cluster of 12 party balloons reportedly got away from a party at Milestone School in Mount Vernon. As the sightings were taking place last Wednesday, the news was almost immediately picked up by media outlets all over the world, and the incident is still making headlines today.
Big headlines, and it would have been great if it was a more exciting sighting, because I mean, even the guys in the video are like, oh, look at the balloons, I got some balloons here, and the still picture is interesting, but I mean, it's possible, and I know that's something you and I want to do, and that's one thing we need to do is take some balloons tied together and take a picture and zoom in and see how they get distorted, especially when you really zoom into these things.
Balloons behave very strangely when they're at a high altitude.
Yeah.
Wind currents and things. We're not used to I don't know, it's difficult to wrap your head around
and currents
what's
change.
Actually going on up there.
There's levels. Wind may be going one way at one height and then a different way at another height.
However, with this story, it's interesting. Looking at some of the pictures, definitely look like balloons.
Yeah.
But you heard the multiple varying descriptions of these things from different colors. The FAA said they received reports of yellow, and the balloons, several of the balloons in Times Square were yellow balloons, so that would make sense, and those pictures did look like balloons.
Mm-hmm.
But there were other descriptions given of something moving in a jellyfish-like way, which is becoming a common explanation for some of these things seen in the sky that appear to be like balloons, but not, more like a living entity. Mm-hmm. So there were just so many different descriptions, but that's not uncommon with a UFO sighting either. I mean, every witness seems to have a different explanation or a different way to describe the object. Mm-hmm. But some of the details were strange with this, but I think the big news was just how quickly the story was picked up by everyone. Fox News,
still being
AOL,
followed.
Still being followed. And then the one story about the balloons comes out from the school, and then everybody picks that up and says, oh, it was just balloons. But there was just hype after hype about these little dots in the sky, which there are many more exciting sightings in New York City all the time. There's a lot of activity in Brooklyn, but these little dots in the sky generated so much attention this week.
Yeah, yep. Hopefully it just shows that the media is more willing to pick up these kind of stories. Maybe it shows because of Leslie Kean's book getting so much media, and the Robert Hastings, the whole nuclear Air Force press conference that happened the other day getting so much attention, that they're kind of poised and ready to pick up UFO stories. I hope that's the case, and so maybe another big one will happen that will hit the media in the next few days.
Well, Friday marked the one-year anniversary of the infamous Balloon Boy hoax that ignited a media frenzy. And 1 year later, are media outlets using any better judgment when it comes to reporting UFO news? I don't know. You know, there's still the hype, there's still the sloppy research or lack of any research. Mm-hmm. I guess for a while after the Balloon Boy incident, they sort of stopped giving so much attention to UFOs, which, that was something that really hurt the UFO field. But now we're back at it again, where something little happens and we've got to report it all over the place. And
because the incident did kind of support some people's perceptions of people in the UFO field as people that are prone to hype up an event to get attention when it's not really something, it's a hoax like that was. Which luckily this person is by far in the minority, because most people are very serious about this stuff.
But as we mentioned last week too, overall it seems like the subject's being taken more seriously by the media, which is great. Even when things like this happen, they're all, oh, it was balloons. They're still presenting it in a way that's much better than they have in the past.
True. Yep, I agree with that.
I mean, even the delivery from the reporters when they're initially reporting the story. You know, it used to start off with a joke or a smile or, oh, looks like green men are coming.
Yeah.
But most of these stories were reported just like every other story.
And some of them include some of those other more credible incidents, such as...
And lots of references to the recent press conferences and to Leslie Kean. And so
it gives them more life, their stories, which is great.
Alejandro, that is it for the news. Remember to check out these stories and more at openminds.tv, your source for UFO-related news. I'm Jason McClellan, and you've been briefed.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Really interesting stuff going on this week. Of course, I'm sure many of you have your own opinions about what happened in New York. Perhaps New York Lily, who's in the chat room, has some ideas that she would want to share in the chat there that I can mention on the show, and perhaps ask Mr. Hellyer about. So remember, you can go to openminds.tv, go to the radio tab. There you can ask some questions, which we will ask of our guests. And before we get to our fabulous guest today, I do want to mention some of the stories that we do have on the internet, and they are very interesting, including, this is a great one. This is USOs. People are really interested in USOs. What's that? That's an underwater submerged object, essentially unidentified submersible object or unidentified submerged object. It's a UFO under the water. Of course, these are typically seen when they come out of the water, although sometimes they are seen underwater cruising around. In fact, there have been some stories of, in fact, in this story, there are some stories like this where Navy personnel have tracked something moving extremely fast under the water, and they don't know what it is. This is a story written by Antonio about some of these such sightings in Chile and Peru. One of the real exciting ones, you may know of this gentleman, and let me click on here to get his name because I can't remember it. But you may remember, his name is Thor Heyerdahl. Really cool guy, a hero of mine. I remember when this took place, and I thought it was really neat. And essentially, this guy said, you know, the Egyptians, some of these more ancient cultures, could have sailed across the ocean and possibly even sailed to the Americas. You know, most scientists and historians said, no, there's no way that could happen. So he said, okay, I'll prove it. And he made a reed boat similar to like they made back then. And the first one he tried to sail across sunk, but then he built another one and did it again, and he was successful, proving his point. I just love the whole idea. Well, I guess being in this field, you know, you would. But the whole idea of someone being told, no, that can't happen, but taking it into his own hands to prove that, yes, indeed, it can. Anyway, during that Ra 2, that's what it was called, voyage, where they were sailing across, they had an amazing UFO sighting of this disc coming out of the water, and it looked like, you know, a circular, like it was going straight up on its side, coming up out of the water, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, getting huge, and then coming towards them. He said it was looked aluminum until it went back down under the water and went away. It was a scary and incredible sighting. You know, we have some of his quotes in here, what he said about it, but really exciting sighting. And this was recorded in the story that Antonio had written. Also, there are other, you know, Chile Navy chief who's written about this, some other officials from the area talking about different sightings in the Peru-Chile area. So that's a really cool sighting, or a really cool story that Antonio did. Really, our website, I'm really proud of it because we have some great writers like Antonio and Michael Schratt, myself, of course. And we have some other contributors who put in some really exciting stories where you really get to be informed, very much so, even if you don't have our magazine, although you're going to need our magazine for the beautiful pictures and everything as well. Some of the other stories that we have, you may be aware of a series which Michael Schratt does called UFO Case Files Revealed. And essentially, Michael Schratt, well, he is an aerospace historian and a draftsman, so he's well versed in and doing illustrations using AutoCAD to do 3D illustrations. And so what he's done in the past is gone into the files of some of the major UFO organizations, such as CUFOS, which is the Center for UFO Studies, which Alan J. Hynek put together, and put some stories, get some of these sighting reports, and then take what they had said and put them into these AutoCAD. So we've talked about this kind of thing before. So you have these 3D renderings of the craft that these people had seen, which really punctuates the story and gives you a better idea of what they saw, and really in many of these cases how astonishing or how close these objects were, and how it gives you a sense of what they must have felt like when they were seeing these things in front of them. Plus, from a description given by someone, it's difficult to tell what a craft may have looked like. So when you see this, you can tell much better what these things really look like. Someone like Michael spent a lot of time putting them together. This one that we just put up today is interesting because you have some probe-looking things, and it's kind of funny. There's this red fish, and this isn't in Casey Covers, but it's similar to it, and maybe some of you have seen this video on YouTube. But there's a Redfish, Florida video where you see a canister-looking thing floating over the ocean and turning. It almost looks like, reminds me of an R2-D2 type thing, floating over the ocean. I think it's one of the most incredible videos. And this report has a couple other sightings that are very similar of these canister-looking probe-type things that are floating over water or being witnessed by these people. Very strange, with some cabling coming out of them in one case in Canada. Really weird type of sightings. And in fact, the one from Canada also has the CUFOS work around when they worked with the witness and detailing all of the different things that the witness had seen in this craft. Very strange. So you're going to want to check those out because they're different than what most people report. And, one thing that highlights is that not everybody's seeing just discs. Even though discs or cigar shapes are very, very popular, they're not the only thing that people are seeing. They're also seeing a variety of other types of objects. So that's a fun one. Of course, we've got information on New York all over the place, and the sightings out there, and the various different opinions on what might have happened or what some of these things might be. Also, Jason's put an update on space tourism, which is, of course, something that's really exciting because the possibility of I was going to say regular Joe, but the regular Joe doesn't have maybe a few $100,000 around to pay for something like this. But for the regular Joe who does have a few $100,000 sitting around, you will be able to pay for a trip to go into space fairly soon. So there's a lot of companies that are working on this. Virgin Galactic is getting real close with their Spaceship 2 to making this happen. They're looking for places to create their space base to launch out of. So this is getting really exciting, all of this stuff with space tourism, and it looks like it's getting closer and closer. And of course, with some of the talk with Obama wanting to do a lot more outsourcing of NASA, it could just really push this whole industry, give it an influx of maybe some funds and inspiration where it may move further along to where we can actually make this happen. So those are some of the things that have been on the website this week that are something that you want to check out. And I think I already mentioned that Leslie Keene is going to be at our conference, and one of the things you're going to be able to do at our conference is buy her book, of course. I'm going to buy several so I can hand them out. She's the one who wrote the book on UFOs and, government officials and others coming out to talk about that. In fact, in our magazine, we're going to have an excerpt from her book, really from an Iranian general who was a pilot who had experiences flying and scrambling to check out UFOs. But not only is she going to be there, that Nick Pope is going to be there, who also contributed to this book. He, of course, is, we've mentioned him a few times already today, worked for the Ministry of Defense researching UFOs. He's kind of the Fox Mulder of the UK. And so in an official capacity, he looked into this stuff. So he has a little write-up that he put in there. In fact, we just posted today also something from Nick Pope on MSNBC that he wrote, where he's talking about some of these astrobiological meetings that have been happening lately. The Royal Society, which is a big British organization, has been doing this. And he wrote in detail about what some of the conversations were there, including a lot of debate that's going on within the SETI community, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, about how to contact these aliens, and also with some of the UN lady. You know, we had the story, it was a big story that the UN was going to have someone that was going to represent the world to extraterrestrials. Well, she clarified in this meeting, you know, what she was talking about, and that's not what she was saying. Her words got blown out of proportion. But Nick addresses that in his story. But he's going to be there, so when you buy Leslie's, your multiple copies of Leslie's book at the conference, you're going to be able to have her sign it, he'll sign it, and also we've talked about and had James Peniston on the show, one of the Rendlesham Forest witnesses. He'll also be there, so you'll be able to get his signature on your book as well. So, you know, that's going to be great. You're going to have two contributors and the author on this. That's a rare experience, and you can only get that at the UFO Congress. So go to ufocongress.com and check it out. Well, the moment we have all been waiting for, and that is to talk to the author of this incredible book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, the Honorable Paul Hellyer. So, Mr. Hellyer, are you on the line?
I am indeed.
Wonderful. It is so great to talk to you. I was fortunate enough to talk to you before. I got to have dinner with you and your friend of yours, Paula Harris, in Boulder a few years ago.
Boulder, yes.
Yeah.
2 or 3 years ago.
Right. So that was a lot of fun, and it is even more interesting to then be able to talk to you now and to get this incredible book. I want to thank you for putting that together. And really, to talk about, we'll start off with this book. This book is more than, of course, just about UFOs. It's kind of what I would say is kind of the synthesis of the wisdom that, you know, these ETs may be sharing with us, but also the wisdom of people such as yourself who have taken a look at where society is headed and some of the major changes we need to make to survive.
Well, it's my 13th book. I think it's my most important book because it talks about the really big issues facing the planet at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my contention, I hope I get this point through in the book, that our political leaders are dream-walking, sleepwalking towards disaster. And that they probably don't know it, but that's not really going to help the situation any.
Yeah.
Somehow we've got to let them know that they really don't understand what is happening at global warming and how desperate the situation is and how much the UFO cover-up is making it difficult for us to address the problem, even if we could change the banking system and be able to finance it, which of course we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these major issues, I sort of cite 3 things in the book that have to be done to save the planet as a hospitable habitat for the human species, which is a subtitle. And they are, of course, global warming. And I would say this is the most important of all the issues. But then the most urgent probably is to change the banking system and take away the world banking monopoly under which all of the new money is created as debt,
Mm-hmm.
and which really makes slaves of us all, and which prevents us from doing the kinds of things that we have to do, even if we had the political will and so on to do it. And then tied into that, of course, is the extraterrestrial presence and technology. And I say in the book that it is my opinion, and this is shared by others, that the technology necessary to switch from fossil fuels to clean energy in 10 years, which I think is the absolute outside, exists, but a certain very small group are preventing us from knowing about it. And so we have to pry that out. And then finally, I say that the major religions of the world are going to have to stop killing each other and start working together to build the kind of world that is possible, that we all want to see. And that would be a change, but it's something that absolutely is a must. And I think this all ties in some strange way with the extraterrestrial presence and some of the messages that they're sending to us that we're, I think, really unwise we don't listen to.
Right. Now, I guess one question would be do you think that the politicians have a hard time in a democracy? Some of the things to make these major changes that you're talking about are major changes, and possibly, they're very bold steps, which of course I know politicians are concerned about it hurting their chances on getting reelected if they take these bold steps. Do you think then some of the onus is on the public in a democracy?
Well, I think we have a responsibility to put the politicians' feet to the fire. Mm-hmm. They've been having it too comfortable in a way. I don't think they really know what's going on. On the banking issue, for example, I think there's only about one person in 100 who really understands how the system works. And that's amazing. It might interest you to know, for a number of months I've been saying that the cover-up of the UFO phenomenon and the extraterrestrial technology and so on is the best kept secret in the history of the world, but that really isn't true, I don't think. The best kept secret in the history of the world is how a small group of bankers have managed to bamboozle politicians into giving them a monopoly to print money.
Right.
And that has been going on now for almost 2 centuries. Well, before that, but in a serious way for the last 2 centuries. And we've just been taken in by what they have told us. And of course, it's possible, and I don't want to emphasize this too much, but I think they're very clever in providing financing for politicians running for office.
Right.
And in sort of getting them beholden to the financial interests. And consequently, it makes it very difficult for the politicians, even if they did want to take the time to study what's wrong and what they have to do about it, to bite the bullet, as the saying goes. Mm-hmm. So somehow, and I really don't know how, except keep on publishing books and going on radio shows and talking to the people and trying to get them interested. What we can do, unless we can say to the politicians, either you change the system and save the world, literally, or we're going to vote you out of office. Right. Because that's the only kind of language they really understand. Mm-hmm. They don't understand anything except getting elected the next time they're up for re-election. And so it's a big responsibility on ordinary people, but theoretically in a democracy, that is what we're supposed to do, is to inform ourselves and then insist that our politicians respond to our heart's desires.
Right. When you mentioned some of these things in the international banking industry and all of this, I didn't really know much about that until I got involved with UFO research. And then I started to look into, well, where does this money come? Who's in control? And by reading different things, some Jim Mars, who I think is a great researcher, some other people, even more conventional media people who have written, although lots of times they have to publish in some of these places that they don't make money, but they want to get the information out. But it also seems, it's not patriotic. These people who are pulling these strings, who are funding, their concern isn't the country, the America or any of the other countries, individual countries that they are pulling the strings of. Their concern is really their pockets.
Agreed, absolutely.
And so it is an unpatriotic setup. It doesn't help us.
Well, it's certainly not democracy.
Right.
When the governments that own the patent to create money don't create any of it and let a few private individuals do it.
Yeah.
That's not democratic.
Yep.
That's autocratic. It's a system that I call it an infinitely silly system.
Right.
And why we put up with it so long, I don't know, but that isn't quite right. I think I do know, because these people are so powerful, have so much money behind them, that they make and break presidents, and they'll do anything to keep their stranglehold on the biggest scam in the history of the world.
Mm-hmm. I want to get into some more history of how you got into this field and everything, but one thing that you mentioned, and it kind of ties into all of this and what we're talking about, is your friend Peter Jennings. Is that how you say it?
Junot.
Junot,
yeah.
He was sending you information, you said, and when you asked him about, why he thought you were the best person to be involved, which I understand his thinking, knowing you and your concerns, he had an interesting thought, and it's kind of something that I feel as well, but it's hard to articulate, in that this UFO phenomena, by getting this information out, can help enable the different societies and governments to unite, and hopefully help us to understand there are better ways of doing things. And I just have this feeling that it is something that can help us evolve and become better.
I have no doubt about that, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the messages that comes through loud and clear from a dozen of the books I've read, and I've read a lot of them in the last 5 years, is that basically the extraterrestrials are more spiritual and moral than we are.
Mm-hmm.
That we're rather, very primitive in many ways, certainly morally. Else we wouldn't be relying on wars and killing people and huge military apparatus to keep our economies going. We would be building things that are important for the welfare of mankind, and we would change our priorities, and we would set up systems so that people wouldn't be starving in the world when there's lots of food, and where they would have a shirt in their back, where they would have clean water to drink, and a roof over their head, a little basic education, a little basic health care. All these things is what we should be concentrating on, and not building bigger and better weapons to see if we can kill more and more people.
Right.
And it's an irony, really, that and we were warned of this. General Eisenhower said, "Beware of the military-industrial complex." And I think a lot of us didn't really know what he was talking about.
Right.
But that it was really because he, as a result of Nelson Rockefeller, that he gave a mandate to find out how to run the ET file, switched it around in such a way that the file came under the control of private enterprise to a very large extent. And this was a real fast one. And I don't know do you know Carol Rosin?
Yes, I do.
Dr. Carol Rosin?
In fact, we're going to have her at our conference in a few months here.
She's going to be there, is she?
Yes,
Good.
that'll be wonderful.
And anyway, she told me that she was working with Werner von Braun, the German scientist who was brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, that he said of the military-industrial complex, they have to have an enemy. This is the only way they can justify these enormous, extraordinary expenditures on military apparatus. And he said, first it will be the communists, and then it will be the terrorists, and then it will be the extraterrestrials. And that's exactly the way it's working out.
Right.
And we have to expose this. We have to make the public conscious of what's going on and how we're being taken by that group of people. And interestingly enough, they I think are all connected with the banking industry and the little elite group that's been running the world for the last long time, since the World War II, for sure.
Well, I want to talk more about these topics, but I do right now want to kind of go into the history a bit. So one of the incredible things that you did was to unify the different armed forces over in Canada, and that was pretty much your main focus as the when you were in office for the Ministry of Defense?
I would say so, yes. It was a tremendous job. You can imagine how difficult it is.
Right. And I can imagine how much the different groups would resist that idea.
Absolutely. Robert McNamara, who was my opposite number at the time, said it was something that every minister or secretary of defense in NATO really wanted to do but didn't have the guts to do.
Right.
And I can understand why, because the British Minister of Defense, when I discussed it with him one day, he says, well, of course you're right. That's the thing to do. But he says, if you think I'm going to go through that kind of a political hassle, you're crazy. And I understand exactly, because it was a real war of a sort. Mm-hmm. And it was exhausting, and it took a tremendous amount of energy, because you're fighting this, what I've referred to, quoting Lewis Lapham of Harper's Magazine, as the permanent government, the people who really run things. Mm-hmm. The big fortune, the 500 fortune companies, and the lawyers who represent them in Washington, and the same thing to a lesser extent in our country, and the big public relations firms, and then the top civil servants, both public servants, whatever you call them in the States, both military and civil. And they really run the thing. And it's very, very difficult to change anything of substance when they, in fact, want to keep the status quo and keep it the way they have been doing things. Mm-hmm. And so they just treat politicians as people who come and go, and right. are a nuisance that have to be put up with from time to time. And Lapham calls them the provisional government. And of course, the provisional government for many, many years in the States was chosen by the Trilateral Commission under the control of the ruling elite. And they picked the candidates for president for both parties, and then financed them and made sure that they tried to get people that weren't too independent and would read the scripts the way they wrote them without too
right.
much improvisation.
Uh-huh.
And that's the cycle that has been going on, and it's going to be a very, very difficult one to break, believe me.
Right, and I know that's what makes people very cynical about voting, and it can be difficult because when you think of, the influence that you could have on a presidential candidate, when really they need money, period. No president's going to be president without massive amounts of money. They're not going to be able to get reelected without massive amounts of money for their campaigns. And unfortunately, regular Joes don't have massive amounts of money.
No, they're not used to giving either.
But these people you're talking about are.
Right.
So back then, when we're getting back to the unification, I get the impression from what I've heard in your talks and in your book that you were really, that was all-encompassing. You didn't have time to focus on some of the UFO stories, which did come across your desk back then.
Well, that's absolutely true, yes. Mm-hmm. I did get reports of sightings, and there were like reports everywhere that about 80% of them were a natural phenomenon they could explain, and the other 20% were unknown. Mm-hmm. But it was about the last thing in the world that I was really concerned about at the time.
Right.
If I'd had anything like my current knowledge then, I would have demanded answers, and of course I would have asked McNamara what was going on in the United States, mm-hmm. and I knew him real well, so I think probably he would have told me.
Yeah, McNamara is an interesting. I saw you might have seen this recently, and actually it did spawn some questions I wanted to ask you about. But the documentary that PBS came out with on the presidential papers recently was an incredible insight to secrecy, and especially during that time period.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'm not familiar with it, but I can understand it.
yeah, I'm sure you're very familiar with the whole what had happened then. But and McNamara being in the middle of it, and interesting enough, the struggles that he had with having some knowledge of truth, in this case in the Vietnam War, but being at his job to have to lie to the public and tell them something completely different than what he knew to be true.
Yeah, that's a real problem.
So then it wasn't until many, many years later, it would seem, until the Peter Jennings special in 2004, that really got you re-interested or really sparked your curiosity in this arena?
Well, this was really Juno all the way along.
Uh-huh.
He had been sending me information.
Oh, right. Okay.
And he called that program to my attention.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say he insisted that I watch it, that's not maybe the right way to put it, but he urged me very, very strongly to watch it, which I did. And I was very much impressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I found out from Juno, who had some connection with Jennings' mother, who lived in Ottawa, that he had told her that he was a believer.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was just part of my indoctrination, which led to me subsequently reading The Day After Roswell and checking it out with someone I had confidence in, and
right.
coming to the conclusion that we had to have disclosure, that there were too many things involved, and there were some tremendously important policy issues. I'm basically a policy wonk,
right,
as you can tell from reading my book.
Right.
And so I've just said I've got to say something, because you can't. It's the kind of thing that has to be in the open and debated in the open, but you can't debate something that the United States government doesn't really exist.
Right. And it's great. One of the things I was partially involved with the Peter Jennings special, and MUFON, I was a part of MUFON, and we were very involved with that special. And
right.
A lot of people in the field were very disappointed because they didn't mention MUFON. They took the second half and really kind of turned it into debunking, which we know it was a different production company that did the second half than the first half. But, I always it's still good that they had the show on, even though people get really disappointed. Just some media attention does wonderful things, like spark the curiosity of someone such as yourself.
Right.
So I was glad at least they did cover it. And so then, like you said, you got into Colonel Corso's book, and we've talked a lot about him on this show because, Maurizio Baiato has been on this show talking about Corso, and we have a lot of stuff on our site about him. But essentially, him while working at the Pentagon, getting information and that getting material from the Roswell craft, and then giving that out. Now, a lot of people think that it's silly, the idea that he would take this technology, seed it into these different companies that are working on his projects, and then not have a record showing that some of these discoveries were not made in their labs, but were made, through this seeding of technology. But really, I think when you look at how development works, that doesn't seem too odd necessily. Do you have any insight into that?
Not at all, because they didn't want any records. And it was all handled clandestinely, because the whole thing was under wraps then, as it is now. And so I can understand that perfectly, how it was done. And I have no doubt that probably the United States Air Force and the Navy were also doing the same kind of thing.
Now, you were able to then confirm what Corso was saying was real.
Yeah, I talked to someone. The story, which you know from the book, is amongst the things that Juno sent me was this book, and I thought to myself, well, that looks like an interesting read. I'll take it on my holidays some summer or Christmas, because that's about the only time I ever read, extensively. So darn busy. And so 5 years ago, when I was looking for another book to take, this one popped up right in my face. So I said, oh, that'd be a good one to take. So I took it and started reading it, and thought to myself, is there any possibility that this is fiction? Because the year before I had read The Life of Pi, and I don't know if you've read that or not, but it's a book where you don't know, at least ordinary guys like me don't know until you get right in the last chapter whether it's fiction or real. And I came to the conclusion that it was real because I recognized, the bases that Corso was talking about and the generals and all that sort of thing from my own personal experience. But meanwhile, my nephew Philip came along and asked me what I was reading. I told him. He said, well, I'm a skeptic. A couple of days later, he phoned and said he'd talked to the general, and he told him what I was reading, and he said every word is true and more. And the general was a retired United States Air Force general that he had met in the aviation business, and I had also met him. So he, in addition to wanting to get his hands on a copy of the book, he said, I said, tell the general that I would like to have a word with him because I'm going to go public on this. And so he gave him a heads up that I was going to be calling, and I did. And the same opening, he said, every word of it is true and more. And then he went on to discuss the more for 20 minutes, everything what he could without breaking any secrets. But he did confirm that there had been direct face-to-face meetings between the extraterrestrials and officials of the United States government. And so with that assurance, that's when I decided to go public. Well, I sort of, I've referred to myself as being kindergarten then, but then the information started coming in from all over the world, hundreds and hundreds of documents, some of them the real thing and some of them not. Some of them had been highly classified, and then, dozens of books, most of which I have read. And so I'm probably, as of now, about 4th or 5th grade. And some of the stuff I'm reading now, I think, might get me up to 6th grade.
Right.
But it's been quite a transformation. But the major issues revolving around the use of the UFO technology, the extraterrestrial technology, and the question marks about some of the reasons to which it may be being put is still just really very, very important. And we've got to get this out into the public so that somehow, so that people can know what's going on, and so the taxpayers can decide whether their money's being well spent or not.
Right. I mean, that's the whole problem with secrecy and democracy. I mean, it works against the system. Your voter, the people who are supposedly supposed to be running the government, need to be well informed in order to make the right vote.
Well, I think Congress, it's not for me to criticize politicians of another country, but in this case, I think Congress has really been quite derelict in not insisting on having a lot more information as to what's going on with the black operations and where the money is going and the kinds of things that are being developed.
Right.
Because this is basic to democracy, that the people count on them to know where the money's going and to be accountable for the way it's spent. And in this case, as you know, hundreds of billions of dollars, if not a lot more, has been spent when the Congress itself and certainly the people haven't a clue as to what it's being spent for.
And speaking of spending and efficiency, one thing that I find interesting with Corso and his book is it really kind of emphasizes the need for the unification process like you went through of the armed services, because he talks so much about how after he was came back from World War II and was more focused on what they were doing at the Pentagon, that he was no longer working on espionage against the Russians. Instead, a lot of his effort and energy was spent on counterintelligence against the other armed forces, the CIA, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy.
Right. Absolutely, too much secrecy and too many organizations and not enough coordination. And to unify the U.S. Armed Forces is probably as near impossible as anybody could think of.
Right.
But it would certainly save the taxpayers about 10% of the entire defense budget.
I would imagine.
And also make it a lot more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like the intelligence agencies with how they followed up on 10/11 or 9/10, I guess. What is it? 9/10?
9/11?
9/11. I've got it almost right. Because they had enough information to stop those attacks.
Mm-hmm.
If it had all been coordinated and put in the right place at the right time. But they didn't work that way, and we've gone through the same thing in Canada, where our intelligence agencies have been scrapping and have pulled some real boners as a result.
Right. Another thing with Corso, though, is that his perspective seemed to be a bit different than yours. He, of course, was in the military, so his thoughts were how to defend ourselves from these visitors, and he never seemed to be too convinced either way, whether or not they were friend or foe. He said he asked one once, and they said neither. But, however, your perspective has changed from his.
Yes, but I think his changed too.
Mm.
I think he came to realize at the end. He was, in the early days, you're absolutely right. His preoccupation was with establishing a base on the moon and being able in a position to take them on for size. But in later years, I think that changed, and he realized that they were not really our enemy, and that we should try and cooperate with them to build a better world that the one of them that he talked to said was possible if we were interested in having their help. And I feel very strongly, I don't really think that they are the enemy, but I think they've got us taped. They think that we may have some mad people down here sometime with these nuclear weapons, and that this would destroy the world, both for our use and theirs, and that we're really the ones that we should be afraid of, our fellow man, and not them. And I would say that if I had to give an opinion today, which I've just in the course of doing, I guess, is that I have greater fear of the internal conflicts on Earth that have been going on and still are going on, and the tremendous waste they involve, than I do on any attack from outside.
And even
go ahead.
There are researchers, of course, in this field who I'm sure you've ran across this, who are concerned of possible, malicious intention. But, however, what I find is really interesting is the majority of the skeptical astronomers and cosmologists in the conventional sciences, such as Carl Sagan or Dr. Paul Davies or Michio Kaku or some of these others, they feel more like you, that most likely these would be cultures that are more benevolent, that they've figured out how to resolve their problems, and that they could possibly then help us out.
Yes, absolutely. If you go right back to Wilbert Smith, and I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Right.
He had either direct or indirect contact, and he was very much of that opinion that we had a lot to learn from them, and that they were willing to help us if we would just be willing to learn. So that goes back decades.
Right, and which is great, because that's one wonderful thing. There's a lot of very predominant and some of my favorite UFO researchers from Canada. Of course, you have possibly the most popular UFO researcher. Stanton Friedman is a Canadian. One of my favorites is Grant Cameron of presidentialufo.com. And one of the most significant people in this field way back decades ago is Wilbert Smith from Canada. And I noticed that you had, later looking in your files, found some record of his.
Yes, including his top secret memo, where he said that UFOs were real way back in those days, and that the United States government was very concerned about them, and that they were classified higher than the hydrogen bomb, and that a group of scientists under the leadership of Dr. Vannevar Bush at that time had begun working on, in effect, back engineering from the material and information that they got from the crashes.
Mm-hmm. So
it was interesting that there was a lot going on back then, and actually a little more openness than there is now. There was more openness in the early days than there was later, after the Air Force pulled the fast one with Project Blue Book and threw everyone off track.
Right. That's what I think is fascinating about the 50s, is it seems like, especially and even into the 60s, it was a period of time, and of course before them, when the U.S. didn't know what to do with this situation. They didn't know if they should keep things secret or not. In fact, if you read some of the books back then, it seemed like the Air Force maybe did want to acclimate the public and eventually disclose, but that had changed over the years. And a lot of times people say, well, why do you guys talk about the past so much? But that's because there wasn't the type of secrecy we have now back then.
Yeah, it was. I'm sure it was much more open then than it is now. And it's just, it's interesting. In the last 3 or 4 years, we're getting a little bit more information into the mainline press, but not as much as there was then. Yeah.
Right. Hopefully, as it increases, we'll get there. But another great thing about your book, and another reason why people are interested in this subject, really everyone interested in this subject should get the book, but is that you also go over some very interesting sightings that people had come and shared with you.
Right. Yes, and there have been a lot more, and there have been more since. Some very interesting ones, but I put in some that I thought would interest people. And the Rendlesham Forest case, for example, I have a long interview there with Colonel Charles Halt, and I put it in because it goes through all of the different aspects, the incredulity, and then his feeling of, I'm going to go out and put an end to this nonsense once and for all, and then going out and having his life changed forever, and then seeing the documents disappear and the cover-up take over, and all of these things. So he's got the whole panoply of the sort of the approach to this subject, all wrapped up in one interview. So that's the reason I put it in. And but I also put in a quote from Jim Sparks' book, which you would know was, he's one of the principal abductees, and he put in there some wisdom that they were trying to pass on to us. And I would urge anybody who buys the book, it's a light at the end of the tunnel, of survival plan for the human species, to look at what they told him that we should be doing to save our planet, not poisoning our rivers and lakes and oceans and air and everything else, and fighting like mad amongst each other, but saving the planet and preserving it and treating it the way it should be treated by good stewards, and giving the impression that if we don't do something quickly, it's going to be too late. And that is a theme, of course, that I take right from the beginning of the book. And I don't know if you've been following the floods this year. All around the world, seldom a day or two goes past without another flood. And one of the best scientists in the global warming field is Dr. James Hansen. He wrote a book, The Floods of My Grandchildren. Well, the last few weeks I've been saying, hey, what about the floods that are happening now in just about every country you can name? And some awful, disastrous things, including the one in Pakistan, of course, but the one in China, and there was one in Central America last week, in Australia and Canada and the United States, everywhere. And so the effects of this phenomenon are being felt, I think, already. And it's just a foretaste of what's going to come if we don't smarten up and and change the banking system, get the technology, and put it into effect pronto.
One of
Fast
the
as we can do it.
Right. Another interesting concept, which I agree with you, the Jim Sparks abduction situation is very interesting, and one of the interesting concepts that he got from them was this idea of amnesty, that people in the government are afraid to disclose because they're afraid of the implications of some of the things that they had done, and that he supports and was told to support amnesty for these people. Do you think that these people really do have this concern?
Well, absolutely. I think that's a legitimate quote, and I quote that in my book too,
Mm-hmm.
and suggest it at the end, because you can understand from what we know, the people who are keeping the secrets have broken just about every law in the book,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no way that a lot of them would want to come out and say so, especially those that have committed some of the more serious offenses and spend time in jail, which is what you would normally demand under ordinary circumstances. But this is just so important that I think amnesty is essential. And when they finally set up a commission, which they should do, to start looking into it, they will start, of course, with the easy stuff, which is already being released by governments around the world,
Mm-hmm.
and then working their way up, hopefully, within a reasonable length of time, into the kinds of things that have been going on in Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico underground for a long, long time, and try and get a handle on just exactly what they are, including, of course, the clean energy, but there are a lot of other things
Right.
too that I'm not sure that the public would really approve of.
Right. I started asking people that question too. Would you take disclosure if it included amnesty? And so many people in the UFO field feel so strongly, of course, that disclosure needs to happen. But even though it's a main focus in their life, they feel that strongly about it. They're so upset by the secrecy and what the crimes that have been committed. They're not willing to allow that amnesty, which I think says a lot about us. I think, forgiveness is important, but it may be an indicator that perhaps we aren't ready.
Well, I have a section in my book about forgiveness too.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy, but it's the way to go. It's forgive and move on.
Right.
And the moving on is the most important thing for the future of the world.
Right.
And so it's just like some of the African countries where they've had truth and reconciliation commissions.
Exactly.
You have to let bygones be bygones and get on with your lives.
I think Yes, I'm sorry.
We have to do that and get on with the future of the world and hopefully a better future.
I just got excited when you referred to those commissions, because I think they were a hallmark in humanity. I think they were one of the most important and wisest and compassionate things that could have happened, those commissions, where it allowed them all to move on and to, as a community, work together at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some remarkable people involved too. Nelson Mandela, for one,
Mm-hmm.
His example is one that is so worthy of emulation.
Right. So another question of mine then is kind of thinking of then your contemporaries, your predecessors, and with this knowledge, why do you think there aren't countries out there who are, like you, demanding that these secrets be released, especially when they impact our allies and our neighbors?
Well, there could be some arm twisting on the part of the people running the world, as I call them.
Mm-hmm.
The three sisters and then the fourth sister, which is the cabal, military-industrial cabal. There could be some arm twisting there, and there could be some treaties too. I think the British haven't begun to spill all they know.
Right.
They're letting enough out to sort of satisfy the public curiosity at this stage. But when you've got a public that has no idea of what there is to know,
right,
they're like me. And one of the best lines in my book was, I think I didn't know how much I didn't know because I didn't know how much there was to know.
right,
And I think this is true of all of us, or most of us, that we just don't know how much there is to know, and consequently how much we don't know, and we just have to keep on searching for the truth. And I think there may be a treaty between our two countries, for example, on keeping this information secret. I'm going to try and get my hands on that shortly, if there's one that exists, if it's available, just to know. And then I think pressure should be put on our government to put pressure on your government. But it's really, it's wider than that too, because the British and the French and the Germans and the Chinese are getting involved now, and certainly the Russians have all kinds of information in this area, and it should all come out, and the sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Right, because the other thing, yeah, like you talk about, the guys that with the big purse bags are the ones who we're all the countries are going to ask for money, and if they don't want it out, then they're going to obviously be very influential.
They pull a lot of strings.
One of the comments I really liked that I heard you speak to as well about the importance. I think it's an important perspective for people to have, and that is who's really fighting for and paying for the wars are not the same people who are making the decision to go to war.
Yeah, the wrong people have to do the fighting and dying. And I was just talking to my wife about it yesterday. The only people that have benefited from the last 2 or 3 wars are the people who make munitions.
Right.
Because soldiers, and both male and female, have been dying, and civilians by the thousands have been dying, and the military, of course, contribute massively to global warming, especially the airplanes, and so everything. It's a lose-lose situation for everybody except a very small minority of people. And then, of course, to the extent that the governments who are fighting these wars, including the United States, borrow the money, which is created out of thin air by private bankers, the bankers benefit.
Right.
But the people have to pay the interest on the loans. And so, in effect, all the people who shouldn't be benefiting are, and the people who do benefit are the ones that shouldn't.
Right. And unfortunately, like you said, then the taxpayer is not only paying for the war, paying for the loans, paying for the interest, and they're also sending their sons and daughters or spouses or other family members off to fight this war.
Exactly. Which was really a function of U.S. foreign policy, as you know from what I have to say in the book.
Right.
And they haven't accomplished anything.
Right.
Vietnam didn't accomplish anything, as McNamara reveals in his documentary, and the Iraq War didn't accomplish anything. There's more instability there than there was before, and now we're trying to find some way of getting out of Afghanistan without having another fiasco.
Now, being a Minister of Defense, did you have to have sort of a hawkish attitude when you entered into that position, or was that not something that you felt, or was that not the case?
I think it was in tune with the times. I was a Cold Warrior back in those days, and I felt that the Soviet Union was our enemy, and that we should do everything we could to contain them. I was one who was against the use of more nuclear bombs, unless it was absolutely, totally essential, because I got some feel for the kind of damage they do. But on that point, I understand from some people that we don't even know the extent of the total damage, that we don't have any way of measuring exactly how much damage they have done and are doing.
Right.
Still, and if we did, that we would think it was insane that any country would even contemplate the use of further nuclear weapons of any
Right.
kind. Yeah,
Right.
and so
They're
this,
all mad systems, mutually assured destruction.
This is an important point, and I was mentioning it with a show a couple of days ago, that the extraterrestrials have probably been coming to our planet for millennia, but the big waves only started in the 1940s after the U.S. exploded the first atomic bomb.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since then, they have been taking a lot of interest, more and more interest in what we are doing.
Right.
And recently, with the press conference in Washington and so on, just sort of reinforced the idea that they have taken an inventory, I think, of every base in the world of all countries where nuclear weapons are installed or stored, so that they know where they are. And I think, personally, this is just their fear that we're going to do something stupid and decide someday to use them.
Right.
And I don't know whether they would intervene in those circumstances or not, but if they did, I would say more power to them.
Yeah, I hope to goodness they would, because it's a scary contemplation. And interesting enough, I know that Hastings and Salas, who put together that Washington conference, feel that they probably would, and they possibly have, and that's what they were demonstrating in these different cases.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether they were really doing a test run to find out whether they could, in fact, disable missiles if they wanted to or not, or whether that was just a result of the electromagnetic effects of the machines themselves.
Interesting you say that, because my boss has that second theory, so he's going to be exciting to hear that you said that.
So I really don't know. There's
Right.
a lot of speculation in these areas, but just one more thing we should try and find out.
Now, this is probably going to be my last question, because we're about out of time, but from your perspective, you know, the average citizen, maybe the listener of this show, what is the most effective thing they can do to help?
Oh, that's the most difficult question, because my pat answer, people sort of laugh at, and that I think take an individual interest. Certainly, I would urge them to try and learn about the monetary system and how it works, and to then say to their elected representatives, we want you to change it, and if you don't, we're not going to vote for you. And I would do the same thing on disclosure, that they should take it into their hands to find out what's been going on for the last 50 years and take more interest in how the public money has been spending. And again, the only possible way of influencing them is if a lot of people, and you can't just send emails, you've got to do something more than that. But if a lot of people really took a direct interest, wrote letters or visited their representatives or whatever, to try and get through to them, past those layers of protection that they have, and say, hey, we want something different, and if we don't get it, we're going to throw you out of office.
Yep. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you also for your courage on doing what you do. Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species is a book I certainly recommend everybody go get this. You're not going to be disappointed. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Good to talk to you.
You too.
Bye for now.
See ya. And then not tonight. We're not doing another show tonight. We're doing one next week. Next week, we're going to have Keith Chester on, and this is going to be really neat because this is going to be not necessarily just Foo Fighters, but other UFO sightings during World War II. That's next week. Check it out. Thanks for joining us at Open Minds Radio, your UFO news authority. We'll talk to you next week.